As the bombs fell around the world, anarchy and chaos would follow, but soon the first few nations started to rise up, and the kingdom of Minotoba was one of them. While it stood long as the only stable and peaceful kingdom in the north, rebels in the eastern and western parts rose up to crush it. The civil war that followed would be known as the War of the First Republican Coalition, which would almost lead to a complete collapse of the kingdom, especially after the king at the time arrogantly marched against the Republican forces in the Battle of Stonewall, only to be slaughtered, destroying many people's faith in the monarchy to this very day. It was only for the actions of our allies in Langenburg that our monarchy could survive and a hasty peace treaty signed. Several years later, a new king, Gun II, would be chosen after the previous lineage had died out. Sadly, just like our kingdom, he sits on borrowed time, because just as every other goal, he's slowly losing his mind. But just because our faith is written does not mean that we will accept death, especially not if it comes in the hands of the Republican traitors. Thus, the fight continues, which currently is an economic fight, because with the loss of the three-river crossing and the demilitarization of Porto Prairie, the Republicans have been able to set up an effective economic blockade of our nation, cutting us off from our former trade partners and important markets. Of course, the fight is also a military one, and we will need to significantly prepare and rearm our army if we want to be able to defend our current states and reclaim our old ones from the second coalition. However, currently the economy is what we are focusing on, and fortunately for it, despite losing the North End trade node, we still hold on to Brandon, the jewel of the crown and our proud capital. However, with the city less than 70 kilometers from Metis Congress territory, one of the Republican states that rose up during the coalition war, it lies extremely vulnerable. Thus, to secure the city, we have started fortifying its gates and constructing a wall. Meanwhile, our queen, which is incredibly popular due to her undertaking several programs in favor of the common citizenry, has started a new one to ensure food security. While it is costly, with the support of her husband, research and development of greenhouses has begun. She is also improving infrastructure to ensure that food can reach every small town in our lands. At the same time, with the appointment of Eleanor Yorkton as advisor, the Royal College has been restored to what it previously was. While our king holds most of the power in our kingdom, the aristocracy also holds a significant part of it. Power that, if they aren't loyal, could topple our whole kingdom. Therefore, the king is planning to hold a ball, where all nobles will be invited to remind them of his power. However, with the current state of the palace, which has been an unfinished construction site for years, we can't hold it. Therefore, we will pay the construction crews after we failed due to the war, which will restore confidence in us and allow the workers to finally finish the construction. And as a final preparation, we have hired candle makers to bring the light to the evening. However, before the royal ball could be held, worrying reports arrived from our duchy in the west, which forces us to postpone it. The reports are talking about regional nobles having taken over power in the region after the probable death of the duchess. And these nobles do not seek to keep our relations like they always have been. Instead, they have been building up their military forces to take over our kingdom for themselves. Fortunately, the reports arrived in time, allowing us to mobilize our almost 4,000 strong army, train up a few more men-at-arms, and begin to restore some trust in the armed forces through the aristocracy. But more than that couldn't be prepared before the duchy declared war. They were the ones who initiated the battles trying to cross the river. While their offensives seemed to be successful at first, we reinforced the losing areas with our motorized light cavalry, which together with the easily defendable river allowed us to stop them. So the first wave of attack had been stopped successfully. However, in the east, the Republic had seized our demilitarized zone, and being in no position to retaliate, the only thing we could do was to watch. But retaliate against Langenburg we could, as we started an attack to try and cross the river at the most southern point possible. The battle looked promising, but just as we were about to win, the duchy launched its second wave of attacks. While it didn't stop us from crossing, we couldn't stop them either, and they could cross the river in two places. What followed was two extremely long battles that we always were on the edge to lose. The objective of their first was to take back the territory we had captured, and the second was to unite the two areas where they had crossed the river. But despite it looking grim, with military build-up at home and a few smart counterattack, the battles were never lost. Then, out of nowhere, an event occurred that would turn the war to our side. The Blighted Woods launched a border skirmish into Langenburg, forcing them to divert troops. This left a big gap north of Vinnipegosis, the same area where we had 3 unused divisions. Thus we dared to cross the river, and after a while we arrived unopposed to Pelican Rapids. Standing extremely vulnerable, their river crossing in the north was also abandoned. But what was even worse for them was that due to bad coordination between divisions, they left gaps in the south as well, since too many went north to reinforce the area. So not only was their second river crossing also captured, but a second city would fall into our hands. However, we didn't stop there, because our light cavalry had now arrived and utilized the opening to its fullest potential. While we got stopped from capturing Norquay and encircled the whole north, it didn't matter, because some days later, with the fall of Porcupine Hills and the arrival to Blighted Woods, the north was encircled nonetheless. We would immediately begin to destroy all encircled forces, using our land forces to push them back and our small navy to contain them at land. While we did inflict a lot of casualties, with the territory growing smaller and force concentration bigger, we didn't succeed in completely crushing them. But it doesn't matter, with this large amount of forces gone from the main front, it will be a lot easier to advance towards their capital and deal with the plotting nobles. Our offensive started with attacking Roblin, which after almost being encircled was captured. Then we marched south, and despite resistance at first, once we broke through, our light cavalry could exploit the gaps, just like they had done in the north, which led to the fall of both Yorkton and their capital. In addition, all enemy divisions were encircled, rendering them completely useless to defend, allowing us to turn west towards the rest of their cities. Because despite having captured their capital, the nobles continued to fight. However, not after 3 more cities had been captured and the rest were completely open. So despite a difficult beginning, the traitors have been crushed. But now the question arises, who should rule the now reduced Duchy of Langenburg? Fortunately, the Queen has a perfect candidate, Eleanor Yorkton, the daughter of one of the traitor nobles. However, unlike her dad, she stayed loyal to the crown, and she has also showed that she is capable of governing. So with Langenburg dealt with and firmly back under our control, we can finally hold the royal ball. And while the royalty and nobles dance away in the newly built palace, we can discuss what happened during the war. Because a lot more happened than just conflicts. Our special forces, called the Mounties, went through a lot of reforms. Their leader, William Tanner, often called Lord of the Dogs, has opened our eyes to dogs in our armed forces. And plans are being drawn up to equip all our men-at-arms with K9 units. In our economic department, we have successfully started to weaken the Republican blockade, and we have greatly expanded our industrial capabilities with the production of more winter clothing. But that was mostly it, and while we still have a lot of economic reforms and projects we can do, with a growing second coalition on our border who could very well declare war in a year, we must put all our efforts on preparing for them. Fortunately, with our economic growth and reintegration of Langenburg, their blockade has been further circumvented, which means we can focus more on our military. While a stronger one will help us defeat the coalition, allies will too. And fortunately, the Arborg junta, remnants of one of our old duchies, could be swayed by sending them help to defeat the damned. We even went so far as to send volunteers. Then we seriously started reforming our army. And with the victory against Langenburg, it will be far easier, especially as the subjects of the king are now far more loyal. One of the most important reforms is to clear up the chain of command, because with nobles and non-nobles mixed in our army, it has become quite confusing who should do what and how. Thus, making everything clear as day will greatly improve our efficiency. We also modernized our levy system, since they have played an important role in defending our territories, but they still have some trouble. Meanwhile, with the return of our volunteers from Arborg and William Tanner having been able to core our new northern states, he has been preparing to march through the Blighted Woods, who is known to be full of monsters, in order to reach the North Saskatchewan River. With the green light from the king, the hunt for these so-called monsters began. And we did, strangely enough, meet a lot of them, so we did send up reinforcements. However, it wasn't that difficult and we had soon put the whole forest and its important trade node of Hudson Bay City under our control. During this short conflict, our men-at-arms had finally been equipped with dogs. And our king had continued to reform the army. With most of it still in the north, we decided to demand Wadenna from the Stone tribes, a former state of ours. Unfortunately, they saw through our bluffs and refused, because with the coalition growing stronger, we can't afford a war with them. Still, with 2 victories and our army too growing stronger each day, as well as our military doctrine advancing to the point where we are soon equipping our army with radios, faith in our armed forces and the monarchy has been restored from the defeat at Stonewall. And just at the right time, because having infiltrated the second coalition, we know that they can abandon their supposed neutrality and attack us after New Year's. Still, we have some more days of preparations, which we use to train up more soldiers and appoint a new captain of our elite royal guard, who have been without one for a long time now. The new captain immediately revamped our training methods of the royal guard, which allows us to incorporate them with our mounties. Surprisingly, we also had the time to expand their duties to cooperate with our intelligence agency, because even though it has seen a great success at infiltrating our enemies, despite extensive counterintelligence, they too have been able to infiltrate us. With them still not declaring war, we further trained our dogs and then news arrived from the east. The Great Stampede have declared war on the Stone tribes, and while we said we wouldn't attack them, with our spies guaranteeing that it should take at least 100 days for the Republicans to declare war, we decided to send our forces back west and started marching into Stone tribes territory. The plan to win was simple. With not so many Stone forces on our front, we could simply march around the few who were there. This strategy was incredibly successful, so despite having 100 days, the war was over in less than 30. In order to not have the Great Stampede stab us in the back, all we took was Wadenna and the Stone Navy. The rest of the land we left for the Stampede. Since Eleanor Yorkton has been incredibly loyal and even trained up a 2,500 strong army to help us defend, we have decided to transfer Wadenna to her. With it under our control, Hudson Bay City can be revitalized, which will help us further circumvent the blockade, especially since the Great Stampede are open to trade. Then our spies sounded the alarm. The Republicans are moving to break their neutrality, which means war is finally coming. While we have prepared for a long time, we can now rightfully mobilize our economy too, because it is needed since we are far behind on radio production. Still, despite having broken their neutrality, the war didn't come, which is great for us since we will be able to produce more radios, and we even had the time to mine the river going through Brandon to stop any naval invasions of our capital. Then we understood why it had taken so long for the second coalition to declare war. They had waited for the Iron Confederacy to attack us. They had demanded the Blighted Woods, which we of course declined. However, we didn't expect them to declare war, so we had to send all our mounties and light cavalry north. Fortunately, Arbory, who have joined our kingdom, do have troops there. So while we lost Red Earth, we could at least defend against further attacks and even slowly advance towards the pass before the Iron Confederacy joined the second coalition. And thus the war which we had been preparing for began. Our plan is to hold in the south while we crush the Iron Confederacy and build up our radio stockpiles. Fortunately, despite lacking them, we have been able to raise 6 levies and send them to Arbory, which had completely left the southern front with the Republic. And with no major attacks in the south so far, our plan will work perfectly as we actually can focus on the north. Here in the north, the battles were slow as we were fighting against power armor platoons for the first time. But eventually our allies captured the pass and encircled one of their divisions. Meanwhile in the south, the first few attacks had started, and while we seemed to hold at first, they soon started breaking through south of our capital. Fortunately, this was the first thing which we had prepared for 4 years ago. So we retreated to the city walls, which also allowed us to send the levies to the east. Looking back to the north, we had encircled the rest of the invading army, which means we can soon send back our forces south. And soon it was, because maybe only a month later we arrived to their capital and got them to surrender. Just as good news arrived from the south a bit later. Here our enemies had been able to cross the river to try and capture Brandon from behind, but we could destroy the 3 divisions using reinforcements from Arbory and our navy stopping any more troops to cross into our territory. We are also for the first time in the green regarding radio stockpile, which means we have already started training more troops. So with more of them on the way and forces arriving from the north, the time is ripe for an offensive. And the best area is in the forgotten front, Arbory. Unlike the rest, its defenses are weak and the rewards of succeeding are huge. The attack from Arbory truly was the best plan ever, because not only was the Republic of the Three Rivers crushed, but their ally, the Old Believers, have also capitulated. In addition, the huge casualties, with even more to come, has allowed our duchies to advance themselves, tackling the Metis Congress. So there isn't much left of the war, which is fortunate, because only once it ends we can begin to deal with the Republican resistance in our already occupied lands. We continued our advances by first clearing up the forces left of the Old Believers' territory, which heightened their casualties with 3,000 men. During the cleaning we had sent our mounties west to support Langenburg. Together with the Duchy's forces and some of our own already in the area, we advanced towards their capital. Surprisingly, it was left undefended, so we could once again claim an easy victory. After continuing further south and with Langenburg advancing everywhere else, the Metis Congress capitulated as well, leaving only the state of Moose Jaw left. War hadn't reached the area until now, so they were severely underprepared, which allowed us to simply march into their capital and force their leader, the last remaining in the Second Republican coalition, to surrender. The peace deal was simple and unconditional. We annexed everything except 2 states in the north and Moose Jaw, which became our vassal. And so the greatest day of the kingdom is today. The Republican rebels have been crushed and our monarchy stands at new heights. For the first time since the Republican uprising, we also stand without their blockade and free to trade with everyone we want. But the work to defeat the Republicans has only started. To root out their ideas and reintegrate their land will be the hardest part. However, first we celebrated our victory with fireworks and a military march headed by William Tanner, the king's finest soldiers and the Mounties. Everyone celebrated except the king, who retreated into his chamber. For a long time his health had worsened and almost every night his visions would show up. Visions of him feral, which is a state for ghouls where they lose their ability to reason, essentially turning them into zombies. After thinking about it for a long time in his chamber, he took up a revolver he had received as a gift centuries prior, and a noise quieter than any firework yet greater in meaning rang out in the palace. He didn't want to be remembered as a monster, but as the king who had saved Manitoba and avenged our greatest shame. So the city turned from a state of celebration to one of mourning of the loss of their king, Gun the Great. At the funeral the queen was of course the first, and following her was William Tanner, the king's most loyal subject. After returning to his quarter he would find a personal letter from Gun the Great, and in it he received the final orders from the king to dissolve the kingdom and replace it with a commonwealth. Because it wasn't for the monarchy he was fighting against the republicans, it was for the people. And the common good for them is not that the regency chooses a new monarch who will repeat the losses at Stonewall. But before Tanner sprung into action, he had to let some time pass for our nation to recover from the war of the Second Republican Coalition. During this time, soldiers were allowed lifetime pensions as our income can more than handle it. The work to govern our new lands also started for real. The peace deal's borders were for example redrawn, with all of Metti's territory being transferred to Langenburg. This allowed us to focus on Winnipeg, our old capital, and while we won't return it to it, the area still is incredibly important. With the integration of dogs in our garrisons, we've already seen a significant decrease in resistance, and with investment in the area it will further stabilize. We are also planning similar reintegration in Metti's territory, despite it being under control of our duchy. However, Tanner is now ready to act out the final order of the king. To turn our kingdom into a commonwealth for the greater good of the people, and not only the people that currently live in our territories, but the people all throughout Canada. But this is for the next video, so make sure to subscribe to not miss it, and see you there.